Reclamation and recycling are similar but have different meanings and regulatory consequences. Direct use, reuse back into a process may exempt the stuff from regulation as a waste altogether. So that's pretty typical. If you don't do anything to it, think of it, you're treating it as if it was a product. So if you're treating it as a product, how much is it like a waste? Not very much, right? It's almost the same as a byproduct for an intermittent process going back into the process. So specific conditions and restrictions, direct use or reuse is a type of recycling. So it is recycling, but it's recycling without reclamation. Spent or discarded materials, sludges, byproducts, etc. are generally regulated as waste until they are recycled or reclaimed. So typically they're not just reused. Something is done to them before they can be reused. An example is if I have an auto body shop and I'm painting and I use thinners on my paints, I'm going to generate a waste thinner material. Well, I could install a device that would reclaim that material, and then I could use the solvent again, and I would generate some type of byproduct from that. So I would be taking a spent material, reclaiming it, and then reusing it back on site for its original intended use. Okay, so that's an example of reclamation. I couldn't use it originally because it became so contaminated, but I reclaimed it, and then I could reuse it. So materials being reclaimed are usually regulated. So is the material discarded by being either abandoned, inherently waste-like, not properly labeled or packaged, or recycled? If the answer is no, the material is not a waste and it's not subject to regulation as a hazardous waste, go to the bar. And if yes, material may be a waste and may be subject to regulation, go to the next slide. Is the material being recycled by, used as an ingredient in a process, used as a product, substitute, or returned to the production process? Yes. Is the material being reclaimed? No. Is the material recycled on any of these things? These are all the prohibited things. And the answer is no. Material is not a waste, provided it meets specific management requirements. So there still are some things you need to do, but it's not going to be a waste. Is that a big deal? Sure it is. You know, if you're looking at, do I need to do a pollution prevention plan? May not need to do that because these materials are not waste. Am I a large quantity generator? Maybe not, because these materials are not a waste. If they're not a waste, they're not a hazardous waste. It doesn't count towards the amount of hazardous waste that you generate. So there are a lot of benefits to recycling, and especially if you can follow this path and to where it's not a waste. So is the material being reclaimed? Yes. The material is a waste and subject to regulation as a hazardous waste, but there can be some regulatory relief. So it's very important to see where we're falling. Both of them are recycling, but one less regulated, one more regulated. Oops. As soon as we finish the class. So regulatory recycling exemption, the vast majority of the recycling specific exemption exclusions are in statute, California Health and Safety Code 25-143.2. Everybody should have a copy of this when they're out doing inspections, because this is where basically the recycling exemptions are. So this is the real focus of the class, this section. There are specific requirements in 66261.6 for specific waste, hazardous waste burned for energy recovery, spent lead acid batteries being reclaimed, recyclable materials used in agriculture waste elemental mercury, scrap metal when recycled, specific toxicity characteristic requirements, and spent fluid catalytic cracking, FCC catalysts when reclaimed in a specific manner. So there are some more exclusions in 66261.6. Intermediate manufacturing process streams. So this is in California Health and Safety Code. This is the law. Materials or combination of materials that is produced as part of a manufacturing process and is used on site on a batch or continuous basis, same or different manufacturing process to produce a commercial product and is not a recyclable material. So these are intermittent processes. So it's a process, takes several steps. In one of those intermittent steps, you don't call the material a waste. Okay, it's still part of a process. So this is in the law. So it can't already meet one of the requirements for something to be a recyclable material. It has to be you're not taking a material from another process and bringing it in as a recycled material. So this is, I start with a product, and let's say I go through 3 steps to make a product. So start with raw materials, I go through the steps, and in each one of those steps, I end up with a material, but not a final material. So both the feds and the state said, we don't want to regulate those intermittent materials. So you don't look at because they could have hazardous properties, and it's not a product, but it's not a waste either. It's part of a process. So it may come out of a process and sit in a tank. Just because it's sitting in a tank doesn't mean it's a waste. Because it's step 1 going on to step 2, or step 2 going on to step 3. Other waste material specific exemptions with many specific or unique conditions, labeling, handling requirements, storage limitations, documentation, destination facility requirements. Mess up any of the conditions, the exclusion exemption is lost, and it goes back to being a hazardous waste. So you have to meet the conditions. If you don't meet the conditions, you lose the exemption. I had somebody at the break was talking to me about universal waste. Universal wastes are a subset of hazardous waste. If you follow the conditions, you're allowed relaxed management requirements for universal waste, correct? But if you don't follow those, it reverts back to being a hazardous waste, and you have to meet those requirements. So you always have the option on universal waste to manage it as hazardous waste. Or you can follow the conditions and manage it as universal waste. But you can't just like throw it to the trash and say, well, it's only universal waste, not hazardous waste. You lose those exemptions, and then it becomes hazardous waste again. So it would be illegal disposal of hazardous waste, not illegal disposal of universal waste. Same with this stuff. The recycling exemptions, if you don't follow them, then you're going to lose that. So some other ones that have specific exemptions, recycled oil, universal waste, drained used oil filters. We know if drained used oil filters go to a scrap metal facility, they're not hazardous waste, right? But there are conditions that they have to meet on that, isn't there? If they don't meet those conditions, you lose that. Spent lead acid batteries, empty containers, reusable soiled textile materials, and photographic waste. They're still dental office that refuse to go digital. But I mean, who takes pictures with film anymore? I mean, almost nobody does. If you're into advanced photography, maybe you still are. So here we land on California Health and Safety Code 25143.2. This is California's recycling exemptions exclusions. It also refers to other regulatory, statutory, management documentation requirements. Some provisions completely exclude the material from classification of a waste. Other provisions allow hazardous waste to follow less stringent management standards. The same as universal waste. If you mess it up, you lose them. But if you follow it, you get regulatory relief. Recycle or reclaim certain hazardous waste at a non-permitted facility, so not a TSDF. Burn or otherwise process certain oil or fuel waste in specific units such as refineries and public utilities. Transport by a registered waste hauler may not be required during pre-reclamation consolidation. So these are all specific exemptions that you may be able to utilize. Consolidate from a generator's multiple sites, then recycle it at one main site. So we'll go into these in detail. Statutory recycling exemptions are not a free ride. Recyclable materials are subject to California hazardous waste statutes and regulations. Unless the recycled material are otherwise exempted or excluded by these or other regulations, recyclable materials used in certain ways are waste when recycled. So if you follow, and again, this is the EPA, if you're doing these types of things, they don't give you a pass. What are they? Use constituting disposal. What does that mean? Come on, you guys should be firing them out now. Putting it on the land, right? Use constituting disposal means it's going to the land. Burning for energy recovery, speculative accumulation, inherently waste-like. So what does inherently waste-like refer to? Dioxins. Used or spent etchants and used oil. Most of the 25-143.2 exclusion exemptions contain wording except as otherwise provided in subsections E, F, and G, recyclable materials that is managed in accordance with section 25-143.9. What does it mean? You still have to follow these things. What happens is when you get into recycling a waste, you get out of the generator requirements and you go into the recycling requirements. So what it's saying is if you're going to use these exclusions, these are your requirements that you have to follow now. So it's different than what Title 22 has for generators. So again, this is a big deal. It gives you regulatory relief, but not on everything. It's not carte blanche. You still have to meet certain requirements. So 25-143.9, it's still a hazardous material. So you still have all the requirements for a hazardous material, and it has labeling requirements. So instead of following the labeling requirements in Title 22, you follow the labeling requirements in the Health and Safety Code. I got a question.
We've been told that regardless of the amount of ERM, that the way that the statute is written is that you have to have an HFDP. It's not that if you reach a certain threshold.
Really? And how did they make that up?
Because, well, we can cite it, 25143.9B.
Okay.
Well, they're basically, regardless of ERM quantity stored on site, you must maintain a hazardous materials business plan.
Interesting. Now, let me take a look at that at the next break. But what they were trying to say is that, you know, it's still a hazardous material. You still have to manage it in a manner. So you cannot have a pile of the stuff on the ground without a label on it and say, oh, that's material we're going to recycle. So I don't have to do anything because I'm going to recycle it. No, there's still requirements you have to meet. So you can't be doing any of those use constituting disposal, burning, speculative accumulation, all those prohibitions. Requirements for record keeping. You have to prove that you're recycling upon request. So who has authority over recycling? What agency has authority? Well, what agency? No, actually, the CUPAs do. So they gave it to the CUPAs. So as an inspector, you can tell the business that's doing recycling, you know, show me the records. I want to see the record showing that it's legitimate recycling. And G, the stuff is not exempt from classification as a hazardous substance. So if you're shipping it, you have to follow DOT rules, fire code, all that stuff would still apply. Well, it still would be regulated on the CUPA. I don't know why the thresholds would be different. I want to take a look at that. He's saying at any amounts. So that's different. It would apply as a hazardous material. It would have to be managed as a hazardous material. What they're saying is we're giving you exclusions on hazardous waste rules. We're not giving you an exclusion on any other rules. Only hazardous waste. So if it's a hazardous material, you have to follow fire code, business plan, all those other requirements, DOT, OSHA. You need to follow all of those requirements for hazardous materials. Doesn't give you an exemption on any of those requirements, only hazardous waste. We'll get into that because I go into detail on these. So when we get to record keeping, we'll look at that. There's a couple different things that are on there. This is our first regulatory exemption. There are 3 exemptions. So it makes it pretty easy to remember. There's B, there's C, and there's D. So when you're thinking about recycling, think about which one of these does it fall under. Is it B, is it C, or is it D? And I'm going to go into detail on this because this is, I want you to be able to walk away, and if I gave you a scenario, you could tell me which one of these it falls into. All right, so let's go with the first one, B. The first thing that's really important on B is that it's not a waste. So that's a big deal, right? If it's not a waste. If it's not a waste, it's not a hazardous waste. Does that mean they can do whatever they want with it? No. Why? Because there are requirements on the exclusion in the Health and Safety Code that tell them that they still need to do additional things. But it's not regulated as a hazardous waste anymore. It's regulated as an excluded recyclable material. So, except as otherwise provided, we get that statement. These are on or off-site use, reuse exclusions. On-site or off-site. What that means is I can send this material off-site as if it was a product to be reused. I'll give you an example, one of my favorite examples. I'm a company and I use isopropyl alcohol in my process. The isopropyl alcohol that I use has to be very pure. So I use a very technical grade. It is 99.999% pure. And I use it through my process. As I use it through my process, slowly over time it picks up some water. And eventually it gets to the point where it is only 98% pure isopropyl alcohol. And the other 2%, let's say, is just water. But it doesn't work in my process anymore for me. For me, it's a spent material. So is a spent material, can that be something that's a waste? So we agree that it's a spent, I can't use it anymore, I'm going to relinquish it. So it makes it a waste. Isopropyl alcohol is ignitable. So it's a hazardous waste. It meets the definition of an ignitable waste. So I have generated a hazardous waste, correct? But there's a company across the street and they buy isopropyl alcohol in their process, and the concentration to them is not critical. They can have it all the way to 5% water. As long as it's 95% pure, it's good to them. Well, my stuff is 98% pure. They can buy all the way down to 95. could I sell them my material and they use it in their process? Would it be an effective substitute for what they buy? Does it pass the giggle test? It seems legitimate, right? So how am I managing that material any different than a product? It's not being managed any different. If I'm going to ship it to them, I'm going to ship it to them on a bill of lading, and it's going to have to meet DOT requirements. And then, you know, I would have it in my business plan. If it goes over to their business, it would be in their business plan. It'd still be managed as a hazardous material, but it's being managed as a product. So it makes sense to allow that to happen. The government wants to promote recycling. Instead of throwing that material away, another business could use it as is. So the federal government said this is okay. So this is allowed for RCRA or non-RCRA recycling. And really this really applies just to RCRA, because there are other exemptions that if it was a California, you probably would want to, I mean, you could use this one. It wouldn't hurt you. But the main thing is the federal government allows this. So what are the criteria? Used or reused as an ingredient in an industrial process to make a product if the material is not being reclaimed. So this is key, not being reclaimed. Used or reused as a safe and effective substitute for a commercial product if the material is not being reclaimed. Return to the original process from which the material was generated without first being reclaimed if the material is returned as a substitute for raw material feedstock and the process uses raw material as a principal feedstock. So basically, there's no shams going on here. You're using the material as is without reclamation. That's the big key on this one. On-site, off-site, RCRA, non-RCRA must be used without reclamation. So no reclamation. I call it the MC Hammer rule. You can't touch it. So use it as is. Any questions on that one? Pretty straightforward, right? RCRA, non-RCRA, on-site, off-site, no reclamation. Couple of points. This is just kind of my summation. Can reuse on-site, off-site by anyone. Essentially like a regular hazardous material, though still needs that ERM label. So you still have to have it labeled, correct? Stuff may still be US DOT or OSHA hazardous material. You still need all those additional hazardous material requirements, and it can't meet any of the tar or sham requirements. So we talked about what those are. So you want to make sure that it's a legitimate recycling. I think the example I gave was pretty good legitimate recycling. They were using it as a substitute for a material that they were purchasing. There was no difference in the quality of the waste I sent them and the material that they were buying. The next one is C. The big thing on C is it is a waste. So you don't get out of the waste requirements. Is this important? Yeah, if you're storing it in tanks, then you're going to have to assess those tanks. Do you count this towards your amount generated as a generator? Does it go towards the size of generator that you are? Yes, it does. Is it impacted if you're doing biennial reports? Yes. Does it impact you on pollution prevention plans? Yes. How long can you store the waste before you recycle it? You have to recycle it within your generator time limit. If you're a large quantity generator, you have 90 days. What restrictions do you have under B? How long can you store it for? As long as you don't get into that speculative accumulation. So remember, it's not a set date, but it's 75% within whatever inventory you had January 1st. So what does this give you? Basically what it gives you is it allows you to treat hazardous waste without a tiered permit. So that's something, but that's basically what you're getting out of this. You can recycle or reclaim your waste any way you want without a tiered permit. You don't need a tiered permit. So the material is a petroleum refining waste containing oil that is converted into petroleum coke, blah, 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 blah. This exemption for refineries. The material meets all the following conditions. The material is recycled and used at the same facility which the material was generated. So on-site generated, on-site used. You cannot take this material, reclaim it, and sell it as a product under this exemption. It must be reused on-site. So my example that I gave you where I had the solvent as an auto body shop and I was reclaiming it and using it at my facility, that falls under this exemption because I generated it on site, I reclaimed it on site, and I reused it on site. See, and I got to it. It just took me time. Okay. The material is recycled within the applicable generator and or storage facility accumulation time limits. So if you go past your 90 days, now you're storing hazardous waste past 90 days, you're no longer a generator, you just became a facility without a TSDF permit. Do you think that's bad? Oh yeah. That's why that's so important, that accumulation time frame, because if you go past that, you don't follow generator rules anymore. Now you have to follow facility rules. The material is managed in accordance with all applicable DTSC requirements for generators of hazardous waste. The only really exception that you get for that is you're allowed to put the excluded recyclable material label on instead of a haz waste label. But the accumulation date needs to be on there, and you need to manage it within your accumulation time frame. Any questions? All right, so a couple examples of some distillation units for recycling on-site use. The last one, D, and D is complicated, but the big deal with D is it's not a waste. So this is the other one that's not a waste, but the criteria on this one is it must be non-RCRA. So the state can never be less restrictive than the federal government, correct? So B and C are federal exemptions because they allow that for federal waste. So that's why it can be RCRA or non-RCRA. But for D, what they did is they created some additional exemptions, but they can only be for non-RCRA because these exemptions would not be allowed for RCRA waste. So that's a big thing. It must be non-RCRA. Remember that table where we had the sludges, we had the byproducts, and we had the commercial chemical products. Under the federal government, if you reclaim them or recycle them, they're not a federally regulated waste. So they would be regulated as non-RCRA. That's where that table can really come in. If you have a RCRA waste and you're recycling it, look at the table and see if it falls out. If it does, then you can use D. And I almost prefer D over B. All right, so it has 7 different exemptions. So D's the long one. If you look at Health and Safety Code, it's more than a couple pages long. The material can be shown to be recycled and used at the site where the material was generated. Does that sound familiar? The material is recycled and used at the same facility which the material was generated. Does it sound familiar now? What's the difference between C and D? Yeah, no, the big difference is C is a waste and D is not a waste. That's critical because under C, you've got all of those restrictions. Under D, you only have the recycling restrictions. You don't have any generator restrictions because it's not a waste. B is not a waste, D is not a waste, C is a waste. But B is RCRA, non-RCRA, D is only non-RCRA. It's kind of confusing, but once you get this down, it totally makes sense. So if you have a non-RCRA waste, there's no reason to use C. You'd be crazy to use C because C has all kinds of restrictions. You want to use D, 1, because it has no waste generator restrictions. It's not a waste. So huge benefit. And it's basically the same wording as long as you are using it on-site, reclaimed on-site, generated on-site. This is a great exemption. So if you had this printed out, this would be a big star because this is, I think, one of the best ones. So it applies to non-RCRA hazardous waste only, may have some conditions attached, but can be broader than C. There's no limitations on what type of reclamation. It's not saying how it is reclaimed. It just says generated, reclaimed, and reused on site. So basically, you can do whatever you want to do it to reclaim it. No limitations. Well, you have to demonstrate. That gets into, he's asking, how come it's in quotation? Because you have to be able to demonstrate it. It's not black and white. It has to be legitimate. So it's each individual case. They can't put anything in the regulation saying this or that. It's just can be shown to be recycled. So it has to be legitimate. It has to meet all those other things that we've already talked about that we would consider a sham or a tar. Material qualifies as one or more of the following. The material is a product that has been processed from a hazardous waste or has been handled at a DTSC permitted authorized facility to process or handle the material if the product meets both of the following conditions. The product does not contain constituents other than those for which the material is being recycled that render the material hazardous. The product is used or distributed or sold for use in a manner for which the product is commonly used. So this one allows you, under certain circumstances, to reclaim it on site and sell it off site as a product. But it has to meet these conditions. Remember, one was do whatever you want to it, but you got to use it on site. If you want to sell it as a product, you got to meet these conditions. So there is some allowances for non-RCRA waste to be recycled on site or reclaimed on site and then shipped off as a product. But you got to meet these conditions. I haven't really seen much in the way of doing that. Number 2, the material qualifies as one or more of the following: petroleum refinery waste containing oil that is converted into petroleum coke at the same facility the waste was generated, unless the resulting coke product would be identified as a hazardous waste. And this is a coking exemption. Again, refineries. And this was 2B. So there's more than actually 7 because 2 has several categories. And then 2C, oily waste managed by refinery or public utility and meets all of the following. So this is a special public utility refinery exemption for oil and solvents. So material is either burned in an industrial boiler, so it's under certain conditions you can burn for energy recovery. Material is managed at the site where it was generated, managed at another site, owned or operated by the generator, etc. If the material is generated in the course of oil or gas exploration. And the third one, material does not contain constituents other than those for which the material is being recycled. So it can't have any other materials added to it other than, and this is really for oil and oily waste. So just special allowances for oil companies and for utility companies. Don't see it very often. And 2D, the material is a fuel that is transferred to and processed into a fuel or other refined petroleum product at a petroleum refinery. So again, this is another petroleum refinery exemption. It makes sense that if they're processing oily material, why can't they take their oil waste and feed it into their process to make a product? It's not really that much different from the feedstock that they're putting in there to begin with. So again, does that seem legitimate? Recycling seems legitimate. I mean, it's the same. It's the waste material. It has the same properties as the raw feedstock that they're using, and it's not less beneficial for them to use that. Number 3, transported between locations operated by the same person who generated the material if the material is recycled at the last location operated by that person, and all of these conditions apply. So basically what it says is that if I have several facilities, I can drive the waste to my one main facility and recycle it there. So it's all their waste. They don't need to use a manifest to drive it. They don't have to be a licensed hazardous waste hauler to drive it. It just allows them to consolidate the same type of waste. Now, why are they allowed to do this? Doesn't the federal government say hazardous waste must be transported using a manifest? It's not regulated by the federal government, so it's not a RCRA waste. Again, that's why it's important that it be a non-RCRA waste on these. They're allowing things that the federal government would never allow you to do this. You can't do this with a federally regulated waste. You're hauling hazardous waste without a transporter, without a manifest. The federal government doesn't have any allowances for that, but the state does. They can make allowances because this is not a federally regulated waste. So it's very important. We're only talking non-RCRA waste under D. And the next one. This one is just like so confusing compared to this one. You know, they're almost the same. Material is transported between locations and operated by the same person who generated the material. Doesn't it sound the same as the other one? The only difference on this one is that you send it off-site for recycling. So what it does is it allows you to transport your waste to one site, consolidate it, and then ship it off to somebody else to recycle it. Almost sounds like remote consolidation, doesn't it? So it's very similar. I don't have the remote consolidation requirements memorized, but in reading this, it seems very similar to what is allowed. The only additional thing on this is it has to be sent to a facility to be recycled. And when I say facility, I mean TSDF. It has to go to a facility to be recycled. So it's just allowing you to pull your waste together and ship it off-site for recycling, but it's going to a facility. So if it goes to a facility, it's going to be either on a manifest or it's going to be on a consolidated manifest. All right, so now we get to 5 and 6, and they're similar, and they have the same conditions. So they're like the recycling twins, if you would say. It says you could use this for on-site or off-site, but the reality is you would only really use this for off-site. Because if you were going to do any reclamation on-site, why not just use one? Remember, there were no restrictions on D1. As long as it's generated, reused on-site, you can do whatever you want. But the state does allow you to take your waste and ship it off-site, and the company that receives it does the reclamation. So it's almost like you're sending it to a facility, but they don't have a permit, and they're recycling it through reclamation without a permit. So this is what allows them to do that. So let's just go to the next slide, and it's got the details. So this is what it says. The material is used or reused as an ingredient in an industrial process to make a product if the material is not being treated before use or reuse except by any one of the following. We'll show you what those are. And if the resulting air discharges produced procedures do not contain constituents that are hazardous waste and are in compliance with applicable air pollution control laws. So basically, you're allowed to reclaim it, but you can't be putting toxins into the air in the process of doing it. And number 6, the material is used or reused as a safe and effective substitute for commercial chemical products. So the difference is it's used as an ingredient or it's used as a safe and effective substitute for a commercial product. A very similar wording. And, you know, they would have to pick which wording worked best for what they were doing. Can be done on-site or off-site again, but you're limited on the reclamation. So I got a question. All of these exempt you from generator requirements. So if you don't have generator requirements, you have to meet the Health and Safety Code requirements, but not Title 22, the 66262 generator requirements. So what types of reclamation can you do? This is what is allowed. You can do filtering, screening, sorting, sieving, grinding, physical or gravity separation without the addition of external heat or chemicals. You're allowed to do pH adjustment or viscosity adjustment. So there's a lot of physical things that you can do, but you're kind of limited on chemical stuff that you can do. You can do pH and well, viscosity adjustment's really not a chemical. pH adjustment would be a chemical change. So that's the only chemical. The rest of these are all physical changes to the materials. So you're allowed to send your waste off-site if they're doing these types of treatment to reclaim it. You can do it on-site, but why go through this when you're unlimited on 25-143.2 D1 on the reclamation?
What if you had, say, oil contaminated with coolant or something that would gravity separate, but you want to use part of it but not the other part? Could you use this to take part of it away and use the second part?
Yeah, you can. So she's asking if you're using gravity separation, part A is good and part B is no good. So you would be shipping off part B as a waste or a byproduct, and part A would be the reclaimed part. And you would be allowed to do that. I get asked a lot of times on, you know, what is significant on the recycling? You know, do I need to recycle it 100%? Is it 51%? I'll give you an example. We had a business in the city, and they put in a recycling program to recover ammonia out of water. So the water had about 3% ammonia and it was 97% water. They were able to recover almost 100% of the ammonia. And so they were recovering 3%. The other 97% they discharged to the sewer. The DTSC agreed that that was legitimate recycling. So they recycled 3% and they disposed of 90%, 97%. Why is that legitimate? Because the DTSC felt that 100% of the hazardous constituents were being recycled. So that you can't go by a simple percentage. Again, it's case by case. So you could start with your CUPA and say, I'm thinking about recycling. This is what I want to do. Do you guys think it's legitimate recycling? And you can get an agreement that, okay, we feel that that's legitimate. So you've got to kind of make your case. This is our waste, and this is what we're going to do with it. And they'll make a decision. The last one is for chlorofluorocarbons or hydrochlorofluorocarbons, compounds, being reused or recycled and is used in heat transfer equipment, including but not limited to mobile air conditioning systems, mobile refrigeration, commercial and industrial air conditioning and refrigeration systems used in fire extinguishing products or contained within foam products. So it's a CFC recycling exemption. And you do see that at facilities that do reclamation on white goods, as they call them. So let's look at some of the things that need to be followed. The following recyclable materials are still a hazardous waste. Recycle hazardous waste that are use constituting disposal or used to produce products applied to the land. So there's no exclusion for those. Non-RCRA hazardous waste that are use constituting disposal or used to produce products applied to the land. DTSC can make regulatory exemptions. I know we had one, a company was taking a waste that had zinc and they wanted to use the zinc to make a fertilizer. Zinc is an element of fertilizer. So is it being applied to the land? Yes. But is that its original intended use? Is that what fertilizer has done? Is it a viable ingredient? So they can make a special decision that that is allowed. But you would need that from them because you are applying it to the land. So that's where you would go to the state and have an exception made to that, because normally you cannot have your products applied to the land. Materials speculatively accumulated, inherently waste-like, the used, spent, etches, stripping, or plating solution sent off-site, and used oil under except allowed in certain conditions. F, documentation requirements for anyone claiming an exemption or exclusion upon request by EPA, DTSC, or the CUPA within 15 days. So they don't have very long to provide the information. Provide name, address, phone number of any facility that manages the material and any other information related to the management of the material. So if you're sending it off-site, you have to keep records of what was being sent off-site. Maintain adequate records to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the requesting agency that there is a known market or disposition for the material and that the requirements of any exemption or exclusion are met. So you have to be able to show it's a viable product, that and usually the businesses can. But sometimes, if they're trying to play games, you may catch somebody pulling a fast one. For purposes of determining that the conditions for exclusion from classification as a waste are met, any person, facility, site, or vehicle engaged in the management of a material under an exemption claim is subject to inspection. So basically, if they're saying it's being used as a product, they can go to that site and actually see how it's being used as a product to ensure that it's not just being stockpiled there as a way of hiding it. All kinds of scams go on in the world. So non-compliance with 25.143.9 negates the exemption or exclusion. So material in tanks or containers must be labeled or marked just like any other hazardous waste, except with, instead of the words hazardous waste, excluded recyclable material. Must specifically include the ERM on the facility's business emergency plan and incorporate hazardous waste contingency plan elements. Stored and handled the ERM in accordance with all local ordinances and codes, including but not limited fire code governing the storage and handling of the hazardous material. So it still has to be handled properly. If there is no ordinance or code regulating storage of the material, including an ordinance or code requiring secondary containment for hazardous material storage areas, the material shall be stored in tanks, waste piles, or containers meeting the requirements in 66265, which is interim status regs establishing design standards for tanks, waste piles, or containers storing hazardous waste. So you still have to meet the container requirements for interim status. You cannot store, like I had the big pile of circuit boards on the ground. That does not meet the waste pile requirements. So this is, if they're not storing it properly, they're not meeting this requirement right here. So you still have the ability to make them handle the stuff safely, just because it's not in Title 22 anymore. Excluded recyclable material, this is the label. All the information here is identical, the color's slightly different, and it's got the ERM instead of hazardous waste. Yep. Nope. You don't have to use a hazardous waste label. You have to have the information. There's nothing in the regulations that say that the label has to be yellow for hazardous waste. That's just an industry practice. The red border that goes around it, industry practice, but that's not a requirement. So again, just an example. Do I have any more questions? This is a tank with the label on it. Biennial Recyclable Materials Report. The nice thing about this is it's the same year as the federal biennial reports. It's a different date. The federal reports are due March 1st. These reports are due July 1st. So 3 months difference. And it doesn't apply to everybody. You have to recycle either on-site or off-site more than 100 kilograms per month of recyclable. That would be in any given month, actually. So if you recycle more than 100 kilograms, you're subject to the reporting requirements. A CUPA can exempt any person who operates antifreeze recycling units or solvent distillation units where the recycled material is returned to productive use at the site of generation. So basically, it's just staying on site. It's never leaving the site. Oh, lots of questions. Well, we'll go back. All right. We'll start in the front.
That exemption, that's just from the reporting requirement?
Yes. Next question.
I seem to get mixed opinions sometimes from CUPAs on this. The reporting is done by the actual entity that does the recycling. So if it's sent off-site, it's the recycler off-site that does the reporting.
Yes.
The entity that generates the material.
And I would have got to that because that's a great question. You know, who does the report? If you are the generator of the waste, you may not be doing the report. It's the person that is doing the recycling. And by person, I mean entity, company, whatever it is. So if you send your waste off-site to be recycled, you're not filling out this report. The facility that receives the waste fills out that report. But in 25, I think it was 10, you're still required, what was the number that required the generator to submit information within 15 days? So F. So here's the requirement that does catch them. So they're not caught under 10 necessarily, but you still have to have records. There's no free ride because you send the stuff outside. You don't have to do that biennial report, but you still have to have documentation. How are you going to have documentation if you don't have some kind of information being provided to you? So however you want to do it, I would recommend to facilities that send material off-site to get a copy of the company's report that they do. And then there's some good records for you right there. So the report, it's only 2 pages with 5 sections. If you're doing on-site recyclers, complete sections 1, 3, 4A, and 5. If you're off-site, you do 1, 2, 3, 4B, and 5. So there's slight differences on the sections that you're filling out. 1 material per page 2, on-site or off-site. So if you're doing several waste streams, you're going to have several page 2s. If you send your ERM off-site, there's no reporting requirement, but you still need documentation for verification under F. Okay, so the report is not in SIRS. Anybody dealt with this? You need to go to like Unidocs and download it, fill it out, scan it, and upload it to SIRS. The same as you would do like for the emergency response plan or for your facility maps. It's going to be an uploaded document, but it is not a form that's already in SIRS. So to do that SIRS reporting, you got to manage it the same as like a contingency plan. The report covers the previous 2 years. So this is an even year, 2016. This report is due July 1st of 2016. You're going to be reporting for the years 2014 and 2015. Some special types of recycling. I think we'll do all these individually. Empty containers. So if they're completely empty, 5 gallons or less can be thrown to the trash, scrap metal, whatever, not heavily regulated. Greater than 5 gallons, they cannot go to the trash. They must be recycled, reused, reclaimed within 1 year. Have to have documentation on that. Management of hazardous waste from major appliance. Materials requiring special handling must be removed from major appliances and vehicles prior to crushing or transferring to a baler or shredder for recycling. These materials have a hazardous waste. Persons removing the materials are the hazardous waste generators, not the people sending the units for recycling. The people that take the material out become the generator. So it kind of exempts the original user from those requirements. All right, so I've got some examples. I'll go through them. If we have trouble, we have a microphone here. I know nobody but me is crazy enough to want to stand in front of a microphone and talk. Is this legitimate recycling? An aerospace company generates sandblast grit waste from cleaning of various metal parts. The waste contains lead and cadmium and fails the T-clip for D006 and D008 characteristics. So those are recro waste, correct? All right, what if I reclaim this stuff? These are characteristic, it's a byproduct or a spent material, so we could go back to that table and see if they were being reclaimed, if they would still be a wreck or waste. So that might impact what we're doing. The company wants to package the waste without any reclamation to be used for aggregate in the manufacture of asphalt road-based material. So they're not doing any reclamation, direct use. It's being substituted as sand. You know, what's the issue on this one? Is cadmium and lead a component of roads? So is it doing any beneficial thing in the asphalt? Is it providing any, does it make the asphalt last longer? Does it have a better black luster because of these materials? So it's probably a tar, right? Or maybe even a sham, because you know it's not going to be as effective as a regular material because it's got this other stuff in it. It wasn't an ingredient that was necessary. They're like looking for a way to get rid of the stuff, so they found something that they could do with it. Doesn't have anything to do with the materials that are making it hazardous. So that's pretty straightforward, right? Is this speculative accumulation? A company generates 5,000 pounds of a solid waste that fails the TTLC for metals. The waste was generated on March 1st, 2015. The company has the ability to recycle the waste on site using an exemption 25143.2 D1. On January 15th, 2016, none of the waste has been recycled yet. Has the company exceeded their time for storing the waste? Why not? And so the date didn't start till January 1st. So on January 15th, it's only been 15 days. And they get a whole year. So they're well within their time. Doesn't that sound crazy? Yes. It was generated in 2015. But the date doesn't even start until January 1st. So January 15th, it's only 15 days old. Isn't that crazy? It doesn't look right, but it is. And that's how it works. And that's why it's important to understand that definition of speculative accumulation. Because if you go out and inspect and you go, these guys have been sitting on this stuff for almost a year and they haven't done anything with it. Are they in violation? No. They're still within their time limit. What if this was C and not D? How long would they have to store it? If they're a large quantity generator, 90 days. So that's why I had to tell you what exemption they were using. If you're an inspector, you need to know this when you're checking on this type of stuff. So you have to, well, what exemption are you? How many people have actually gone out and asked the generator what exemption they're using? And they know. Well, there's a couple. It's not very often. You know, that's why I think these classes are so important. I want to give this information to the generators, and I want to give this information to the inspectors. We need to do a better job on the management of this stuff. And if you don't know these requirements, how can you possibly do it right? I got a question. So she's asking on the labeling of this, it would have to have a label on it. They are allowed to have a hazardous waste label on there, but somewhere it needs to say they're going to recycle it, and it has to have the accumulation date, the date they start. They have to keep records on this. It would be March 1st would be the date that they started to accumulate it. But you can't look at it until January 1st because of the way they wrote the definition of speculative accumulation. Okay, Modern Furniture Inc. generates an F003 waste. It's a solvent from the manufacturing process. In an effort to reduce costs, the company buys a small distillation unit that will reclaim the solvent for use at the facility. The residues are managed as a hazardous waste. So what exemption would they be using? Which one? It's a federally regulated waste. So D only applies to non-RCRA. So they can't use D. So it's B or C. Are they reclaiming it? And so they can't use B. B is no, remember it's the MC Hammer rule. They can't touch it. So C, that would be. So, and that's legitimate recycling under C. They are allowed to do that. But it's still a waste, and they still have to follow generator requirements. Molding sands at a brass foundry that are contaminated with concentrations of copper and zinc are screened to remove clay binders and magnetically separate metals, and then they're reusing the molding for more brass fixtures until the sands are spent. What exemption? Okay, which D? You got some choices. You can always use one on this one because it's being generated and reclaimed and reused on site, right? So I like one. One's my favorite because it has almost no conditions. But on this particular one, they probably use 5 or 6, right? Because they're only doing physical separation. There's no chemical treatment or reclamation going on. ABC Machine has several facilities in Southern California and generates the same non-RCRA hazardous waste liquid at each of the facilities. When a 55-gallon drum of waste is generated, or after 90 days, the waste is transported by the company to the main facility. The driver and waste meet all of the requirements of the California Health and Safety Code for transporting the waste. The waste is reclaimed by the main facility and used by the company for the original purpose of the material. So which one is that? D? Okay, and so there was 3. You were actually reclaiming. Member 4 was if you're sending it off-site for reclamation. An acid etching solution is reclaimed for its zinc content. The zinc is then used in the production of a fertilizer. The recycler uses the fertilizer on his own land, but does not market it to the general public. Yes or no? Can they do that? Maybe. So this one, it's use constituting disposal, right? So there's prohibitions on that. So who would you ask? You ask the DTSC if this would be allowed. It's not a federally regulated waste because zinc is regulated by the state of California, not by the feds. So it would not. Yeah, you would still need approval from the DTSC because of the going on the land. I got a pipeline condensate from natural gas transmission accumulates in the pipeline as it is generated. The material is ignitable. When pipelines are cleaned, the condensate is stored in above ground tanks until it is sold to firms using it as fuel. Is that legitimate? What do you use natural gas for? As fuel. And what are they using it for? Seems pretty legitimate that the material is being used as a fuel. Does it mention any reclamation? So no reclamation. Is it being used for its original intended use? So it seems to me it falls under B. They're selling it off-site. So it really has to be B because it's a RCRA waste and it's going off-site. So only B and C deal with RCRA. It's going off-site, so it has to be B. So it needs to fit within the B definition. And to me, it looks like it does. So it sounds legitimate. A company generates distillation tank bottoms from the manufacture of carbon tetrachloride. So it's a K-listed waste. That's a RCRA waste, right? The material is sent to a different company to be used as a feedstock to make tetrachloroethylene without any reclamation prior to use. So what exemption can they use for this? RCRA, non-RCRA? RCRA. On-site, off-site? So only can fit one. Has to be B. So does it look like it meets B? Is there reclamation? Remember, you can't, MC Hammer rule, you can't touch it. Are they doing that? The company uses it as a feedstock. Do they have to reclaim it before using it as a feedstock? So it's a substitute instead of buying raw material. So it seems legitimate. Reused or used to make a product. I see that happening. I got references and resources. RCRA, very good on these issues, but it won't deal with the California issues. And you guys survived recycling. You guys, I know there's questions. All right.
Where would propane tanks fall into a B if you're sending it? I've seen it done either as ECM.
So he's asking about propane tanks that are not empty, correct? They still have propane in them. If they take that material out, reclaim it, and sell it as a fuel, then that would be allowed as recycling. If you send it to the facility and they're burning it off, that's not recycling. So again, it really matters how, and I know there were some facilities that were improperly managing the stuff and other ones that were reclaiming it. They were actually collecting it and then selling it. Usually it doesn't go bad, but the containers can go out of spec. They change the valving on them every couple years. Every time there's an upgrade or an improvement, the old valves will no longer work. So it would have to meet all of the conditions that we talked about in the class. That's why, again, make a printout of this. Keep this as a reference because it's a really good, solid reference. Spent a long time with Mr. Steve Lichten. We put this together in 2008. So if you guys print this out, you'll see 2008. This was updated for 2016, so it is the most current one. I got a question back here. So he's asking about dry cleaning and the distillation units. And there is an exemption for if it's all done within a process unit. So it's all contained. So if it's a contained unit, it's not a waste until it comes out, whatever comes out. So inside the unit, that stuff is not regulated until they would actually pull the waste material out. So you're allowed to process that. Self-enclosed process unit. It's all piped. If you read I think that is in 66261.4. Self-contained. There's one that for a self-contained recycling system. That's once it comes out, but not in the unit, the recycling that's going on in the unit. Any more questions? Yes?
So on that note, if you had a little carbon bed tank, it's not that it wouldn't be a waste necessarily until you get the carbon media out. But you could ship that canister. Like if it's not a big tank, but it's like a canister, you can ship the canister and it's not waste.
So Yeah, if you have a canister, like a carbon cartridge, even if it's a self-contained tank, at some point in time it is spent, then that whole unit would be a waste. And then you do a waste determination on the unit. But not until the point that you determine that it's no longer viable. So it's when it's relinquished. But remember I talked earlier about the fuel tank, and it has bottoms that settle on it. Those bottoms are not considered a waste until they come out of the tank. So if it's a process unit like an air purifying system, the cartridge in there is collecting waste material. The point of generation is when the cartridge comes out of the unit. If the unit is all one thing and you're throwing the whole unit away, that would be the point of generation when it's disconnected and you're going to relinquish it. Point of generation is always critical to determine, how to manage things. At what point does something become a waste? And a lot of times you have to look at the exclusions, talking about the dry cleaning, they specifically address systems like that to exclude them until the material actually comes out of the distillation unit. I got a question in the front. We got lots of time too. It's, we still got over an hour.
A number of auto shops have safety clean part washers. Safety clean removes the solvents or whatever they're using after they have been spent. So who would be responsible? Safety clean?
So he's talking about safety clean and parts washers. If you look at it, at the way that system works, the point of generation is when safety clean shows up to pick up that material. It's constantly in use until they seal it off and take it off. That's the point of generation. Who's the generator? The facility that was using the parts washer. So it's a hazardous waste. They're going to use a manifest, or they can use a consolidated manifest depending on what type of waste, and they're going to use that to transport it off, and they're going to dispose of it or recycle it, but it's not going under any special exemptions. So there's no exemption recycling. It's just being managed as regular hazardous waste. Another question was in the back, I think, over here. Doesn't have to be a monetary. It just has to be a valid, he's asking, to show that there is a market for the material. Does there have to be some monetary transaction? No, there doesn't have to be any money involved. It just has to have a value, and not necessarily a monetary value, but it has to be something that they would normally use. So there's no money involved that by criteria to make it legitimate. But it has to be a viable substitute for raw material. If they got the raw material free and you gave it to them free and it was just as good, then that would be legitimate. So they don't tie money to it. Way in the back. You're going to have to speak up. I got a rattling air conditioner here. Yes, she's asking, is the generator still responsible if they gave it to somebody and they did not recycle it? Let's talk about a good example that happened in Vernon. There was a facility that was supposed to be recycling dry cleaning solvents, and they never reclaimed any of them. They all sat there. So these companies paid somebody to take them there and recycle their materials, but the company never did any of that. They had a shell game going on between California and Colorado, and they were shipping the waste back and forth and not recycling anything because it costs too much money to recycle it. So all those generators ended up being on the tab for the cleanup of the site. So that just goes to regular liability. But if somebody's going to recycle it, you want documentation from them that it actually got recycled. That's why that biennial report. To get a copy of the biennial report from them is a pretty good thing because they're telling you what they did and they're signing that document that it is true. So it kind of puts them on the hook. If they say, this is what I did and I'm signing that this is truthful. Kind of a good way to ensure that it's being recycled. But you are responsible for your waste being recycled even if you're not the one doing it. Question in the front.
I've got a question that feeds right off of that and then goes back to the whole speculative accumulation as well. I understand that if I'm the generator of a material that I'm recycling, it's subject to speculative accumulation requirements, right?
As long as it's not under C, because then it would be regular generator requirements.
Right.
So it has to be B or D.
Okay, so say I'm under one of the recycling exclusions or exemptions that requires me to keep an eye on speculative accumulation. And I understand that the place that I'm sending it to for recycling, like you just answered, I'm responsible for if they're doing sham recycling or whatever. Am I responsible to make sure that they're not engaged in speculative accumulation?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
There as well, so I've got to make sure that
Yeah.
they process.
They have to follow the rules for recycling. If they're not meeting the rules, they're not recycling your material. You sent it to them for recycling. If they don't follow those rules, what happens? It becomes a hazardous waste. They lose the exemptions. They're in trouble. You're in trouble. Everybody goes to jail.
The only reason why I question that is because the speculative accumulation rules are found in the generator regulations and not the TSDF regulations.
No, they're in definitions.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a good thing I know what I'm doing up here. You're trying to put me on the hot seat, aren't you? Yes. The recycling facility that didn't recycle within the time frame? They didn't recycle? Oh, they did recycle? No, they're not TSDF. They're following a special exemption. That's why it has to, under B, there's a federal exemption to reuse stuff as if it was a product. So that's a federal exemption. And then D are special California exemptions that allows some reclamation. Remember, B allows no reclamation at all, but D allows some. So B is very restrictive. D is not quite as restrictive, but it cannot be a recre waste. These are good questions. They're saying it's proprietary and they don't want to give you any information, then I probably wouldn't want to do business with them. As the generator, you're still responsible to demonstrate that your material is being recycled. I think my battery, no, it's still there. You can tell them that if you don't provide me any information, they don't need to tell you all the ingredients that go in there. They can just say, we're using your ingredient as a part of a process to make this. And we sell these. And here's our annual sales for that. So they can give you information about it without going into total detail on everything. They don't need to tell you all the ingredients that go into it. They just need to say how your waste is being used as an ingredient. No, it doesn't have to be hazardous for one constituent. It just cannot be a recre waste. It is a recre waste, then it can't be D. Then it's not a recre waste. If under the table, it's because it's being reclaimed, it's not a recre waste. It falls out of recre authority, and it falls into state regulations. So then you can use D. But it's not a recre waste anymore because of how it's being managed. like circle logic. I think that's the best I can do on that one. Yes? Uh-huh. Yeah, so crushing is not chemically changing something. It's just changing the physical size of it. So that it is allowed. Yeah, it's not changing any of the properties of it. It's just changing it. It's not a regulated treatment. I know there was a facility, they were taking their used rags and they were condensing them, they were pressing them. Well, they were not changing the rags or anything, they were just compacting them. So they fit into a smaller space, but they had all the same properties. There was no chemical change, it wasn't chemical treatment. Way in the back. Yes. They would make the determination whether it was use constituting disposal or if it was a viable recycling operation. Remember that any waste determination or use determination of recyclable material would fall under the DTSC to make determinations. The world isn't black and white, it can be gray. And so you may, like my example that I used of the 3% of material that was being reclaimed and the 97% was being thrown away, and that the state determined that that was legitimate recycling. I would let them make that rather than the CUPA make that determination. Because it puts a lot of pressure on the CUPA to split hairs, to determine the shades of gray. And that's really the state's job. And in the old days, the state had a whole division that was going towards waste determination. And they're heavily depleted, but it's starting to come back a little bit. So there's a couple good people in that division that you can ask those questions to. Got another one question here.
Yeah, I talked to you about this last year I was here.
I'm a glutton for punishment, and you're a glutton for punishment.
Our company supplies anhydrous ammonia to facilities, and they use it in their refrigeration system. Right?
Okay.
After a while, that anhydrous ammonia picks up some refrigeration oils, small parts per million of them, and they ask us to take the ammonia out of their system, take it back to our facility, and we filter the oil out of it and use the anhydrous ammonia in our production process for making aqua ammonia.
Uh-huh.
And we refill their system with fresh ammonia.
Okay. Well, let's break it down. So, company uses ammonia for refrigeration. Over time, the ammonia starts to pick up oil. Eventually, at some point in time, there's too much oil in the system to make it work effectively. So it's a spent material, right? So this is very similar to my isopropyl alcohol example, right? So the company says, we can't use this stuff anymore. However, there's another company that can take that material and use it to make a product. But they have to filter it to separate out the oil from the ammonia. So are they doing reclamation? Yes. So is the material a federally regulated waste? I don't think it is. So, is it ignitable? No. Is it corrosive? No. Is it reactive? No. And toxicity is a list. It's not corrosive because it doesn't meet the EPA's definition of corrosivity. So definition of corrosivity is a pH of 12.5 or higher. Ammonia is around 12. I mean, it's usually less than 12. So it doesn't meet the definition. And under EPA, corrosivity has to be a liquid, and anhydrous ammonia is a gas. So it doesn't meet that either. So under EPA, corrosivity is only a liquid. So it's not that. So now you're down to non-RCRA hazardous waste. And I would agree that it's a non-RCRA hazardous waste. So you would be allowed to use any of the exemptions in D, and it sounds to me like it would fit in 5 or 6. Are you doing it on-site or off-site? You're doing it off-site. So you can't use 1. So now that leaves you with 5 or 6. You can send it off-site for reclamation, and one of the things that is allowed was filtering. So you're sending it off-site for filtering. Is the recycling legitimate? Are they making legitimate products with it? The answer to that is yes. You could demonstrate what products you're making out. So I would say it's recycling under 25143.2 D 5 or 6.
So if we do more than 100 kilos a month, do we then have to file the biennial?
You guys would, because it's going to your facility. Right. So you got a couple months. All right, you guys are great, man. Another question.
Well, I'm ignorant of your industry. Isn't it a compressed gas when you take it?
Compressed gases are solid waste.
D003, reactive hazardous waste.
Why would it be reactive?
Potential to explode compressed gases.
No, that's not the definition. You keep trying to put me on the spot. That doesn't meet the definition under D003. All right. Stump Steve. Who wants to try to stump me? The old retired guy. All right. We got questions in the back? I just heard oil in ammonia. I wouldn't even look at that. I would be looking at just the material itself and looking more at the ammonia than the oil. It wasn't an oil. It wasn't a waste because of just the oil. The ammonia has hazardous properties. I bet that stuff would kill fish. So I'm sure it would meet other criteria. I would look at it altogether and not an oil exemption. Yes. Of that, okay, so she's asking, I send a waste to a facility, they reclaim it, and they create a byproduct off that reclamation, and they're the generator of that waste. So yeah, it's perfectly normal to reclaim something and have a byproduct. And so you would be taking that whole material, you take 100% of it, you reclaim it, and you may get 70% that you can use as a feedstock or whatever that you're reclaiming it with, but you're also going to generate a byproduct, and you're the generator of that byproduct.
So de-blasting waste from prepping a metal surface, and in terms of fine powders, that definition in state law, and let's say a portion of that's going to go through a 100 micrometer particle size diameter sieve and test high for certain metals. Do you require that waste determination for the waste to go through the sieve?
So you're not asking a recycling question, but I'm happy to answer that one. So he's asking about waste sandblast. What's that? Okay, so now you're getting a scrap metal question. So if I have a waste and it has powders and chunks in it, are you allowed to physically separate those? Let's not use the bead blast one, but let's use another one. I have metal waste. Some of it is less than 100 microns, and some of it is greater than 100 microns. So I've got small little pieces and larger pieces. Can I, under one of the recycling exemptions, separate those materials to recycle one as scrap metal and then separate it from the stuff that would not be considered scrap metal? And yes, I can. I'm allowed to do that under D. So it gets complicated, but the federal government does not have any size limit on what scrap metal is. That's a state requirement. So it doesn't make it a federal waste, regardless of what's in it, if it meets the federal definition of scrap metal. So you throw out the federal rules, and now you look at state rules. And the state says it cannot be less than 100 microns. So you would be able to separate out and recycle part of that as scrap metal, but the other part would not meet the definition of scrap metal. Does that mean you can or you cannot recycle it? No, it doesn't mean you cannot recycle it, but it's not scrap metal. So you could do other things with it as an ERM, but not as scrap metal. Scrap metal doesn't require a whole lot. There's no container requirements for scrap metal. There's no labeling requirements for scrap metal. There's no transportation requirements. So there's really not a lot of requirements for scrap metal. But there would be for ERMs. So the powder fines would not meet the definition of scrap metal. They would have to be managed as an ERM if you wanted to recycle them, and you would have to meet all those conditions. All right. Oh, we still got 50 minutes, so we're, and you guys are all staying here. This is what amazes me is you guys are awesome. Okay, so very good question. If I send something to somebody to reclaim it, and they reclaim it and they generate a byproduct that's a hazardous waste, who is liable for that? The facility that generates that waste, not the original. So, you know, if you send your hazardous waste to a TSDF, you are responsible for that waste, even if it goes to a TSDF, until they do something with it. Once they do something with it, then they become the generator. Your liability kind of goes away. They would be primary liability. So if I send my waste to a facility to be incinerated, they're going to incinerate it, and then after incineration, they're going to end up with some kind of byproduct from that incineration, and let's say that is regulated as a hazardous waste. So they've created a new material, they've created a new waste, they're the generator of that waste. They commingled your waste with other people's waste, they chemically altered it, they generated this new waste, it's their waste, they're responsible. If they mismanage that waste, it doesn't directly trace back to you, but it can. Landfills are the worst. Landfills are storage facilities, not disposal facilities. Think of that. Because, you know, it goes there and it never goes away. So your liability never goes away.
Can you buy insurance against such liability?
I don't know. He wants to know if I can buy insurance on liability. Recycle all your waste and don't generate anything that you dispose of, and you'll have a happy life. And that's part of the importance of recycling. You benefit the environment, you get ease of regulatory requirements. So there's a lot of benefits, but you need to know what you can do, what you can't do. You need to follow the rules and fill out the forms. All right. Well, don't forget to, I went and took a look at the evaluations. It asked lots of good questions. Please give me written feedback. Hopefully you guys understand this. If you don't, tell me what I need to do to improve that. What would it take to make this class better? Definitely the 4 hours. If I would have tried to cram this into 2 hours, because there's no 3 hours. It's either 2 or 4. 4 worked a lot better. It gave you guys an opportunity to ask questions and look at Homer Simpson. All right, thank you.